Hello, friends. Today I will be reading I Survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. I'll be reading chapters 7 through 10 today. Chapter 7. Oscar sprinted towards the house, swatting away the burning flakes that swarmed around him. He watched with terror as the fire quickly danced across the roof. Where were the kids? Why hadn't they come bursting through the door? Come on, he whispered, as though he could grab hold of them with his words. But still, they did not appear. Oscar rushed up the crumbling steps and pounded on the front door. "Hey," he shouted, "come out!" Nothing. He tried the door, but it was locked tight. Where were they? Shouts rang out from the street. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Oscar whirled around. Two other houses were burning like torches. The wind gusted and flames leapt across the street. Boom! The house caught fire as if it were made of dried straw. Any minute, this whole street would be a sea of fire. Oscar had to get away. He had to get back to Mama. But how could he leave here if those kids were still in the house? Of course, he couldn't. Oscar slammed his shoulder into the door. Bam, bam, bam! On the third try, the door frame splintered and the door burst open. Oscar stumbled in, falling to his knees. Smoke swirled around him. He rose to his feet, gasping for breath. "Hello," he screamed. "Where are you?" And that's where he heard them, just above the fire's roar, muffled cries coming from upstairs. Or was it the wind and the fire fooling his ears? Was it possible the kids had escaped through another door? Oscar stumbled to the narrow staircase, peering up into a churning cloud of black smoke. "Don't be an idiot," he told himself. "Don't go up those stairs." "Hello?" Oscar called, praying that nobody would answer, that the kids were long gone. But no, "Help us, please," shouted a terrified voice. The girls. He had no choice. On shaking legs, Oscar started up the stairs. He pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose. It did nothing to block out the smoke. Each breath burned his throat and lungs. But the worst was the blistering heat. With each step, it grew hotter. Oscar could practically feel his blood boiling, his skin sizzling, his flesh cooking on his bones. He wouldn't last long up here, and neither would Jenny and Bruno. At the top of the stairs was a closed door. Somebody pounded on the other side. "Here," Jenny shouted. "The door is stuck. Please help us." Oscar pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Stand back," he choked. Oscar kicked the door down as hard as he could. The door crashed open, releasing a wave of heat and even thicker smoke that pushed Oscar back on his heels. He teetered and almost fell down the stairs, but somehow he managed to regain his balance. Jenny came rushing out with Bruno in her arms. They were both coughing and wheezing. Their faces were black with soot and streaked with tears. Jenny was clutching Bruno with all her might, but her skinny arms were losing their grip. Oscar reached for Bruno, and to his surprise, the kid didn't resist. Oscar pulled Bruno into his arms, holding him close to his chest. The poor baby's heart was pounding even harder than Oscar's. Jenny stood up, unmoving, dazed and coughing. Oscar was afraid that she might faint. Oscar grabbed her arm and pointed her down the stairs, gripping her shoulder in case she slipped. "Run straight through the front door," Oscar said to her. "Go as quickly as you can." Jenny did what she was told, gaining strength as they reached the bottom. Oscar put Bruno down at the bottom of the stairs, and Jenny grabbed the little boy's hand. Together, they flew out the door. Oscar was just steps behind them. And then crash, the window shattered. Kaboom, a giant ball of fire and cinders blasted into the room. Oscar fell to the floor, and then there was nothing but flames. Chapter 8. Again, Oscar felt as though he were being attacked by a wild animal, a monster with burning tentacles and boiling breath. It grabbed him, clawed at him, and spun him around. Smoke gushed into his nose and down his throat, filling his lungs with searing poison. He couldn't open his eyes, but he knew the fire was all around him. He dropped to the ground, crawling blindly, groping for the floor. But he had no idea where he was. It was like being trapped in a flaming maze. His lungs were ready to explode. Was this the end? Was he really going to die right here? And then he heard a voice. This way, Mama. Maybe. Turn right, the voice shouted, tugging him, guiding him. Oscar turned. No, it wasn't Mama's voice. It was Jenny's. Yes, now straight, hurry. And then he felt a hand on his arm pulling him up. Seconds later, he was out the door. He was just steps away from the house when there was a terrifying whoosh and an explosion of hot air. They rushed forward and Jenny grabbed Bruno from where he had been hiding behind a barrel. They ran across the street and fell to the ground. Oscar's head throbbed. His entire body felt as if it had been roasted. He lay back and closed his eyes. For a long minute, he stayed there, trying to catch his breath. He might have stayed like that for hours, but only a minute or so passed before he felt someone breathing in his face. He opened his eyes and saw a huge curly head hovering over him with wide open eyes. Bruno. Hey, you're not dead, he croaked out happily. Hush, Bruno, Jenny whispered. That's not a polite thing to say. But he not dead, Bruno insisted, putting his face even closer to Oscar's so his slimy little nose touched Oscar's nose. Then he put his gooey mouth to Oscar's ear and whispered, you not dead. The kid wasn't going to quit. Oscar put his hand on Bruno's head. I know, he said. Jenny kneeled down and gently peeled Bruno away from Oscar. Let's give him a little room, Jenny said. Oscar managed to sit up. He stared ahead at the little house, which was being torn apart by the flames. The wood moaned and sighed as it collapsed into the fire, as if it were crying out in pain. It was sickening, like watching a rabbit getting torn apart by a coyote. Bruno wriggled closer to Oscar until his small shoulder pressed against Oscar's arm. My house, he said, pointing sadly. Oscar didn't know what to say, so he just put an arm around the boy. The fire burned so brightly that it lit up all their faces. It was the first time Jenny had the chance to get a good look at Oscar. Now Oscar waited to see the shock in her eyes when she realized who he was. But there was no flash of recognition. She looked exactly how Oscar felt, scared, dazed, and amazed to be alive. Their eyes locked together, and Oscar couldn't tell Jenny that he didn't recognize the kid she'd tricked at the gas station. She saw a different boy, the boy who helped her, and Bruno escaped from the fire. And as Oscar looked at Jenny, he didn't see a helpless orphan or a ruthless thief. He saw a brave girl who watched over her brother all by herself, whose voice had led Oscar out of the blazing house in the nick of time. And then there was Bruno, who grinned at Oscar as though they'd been best friends all their lives. I, Bruno, he said, looking at up at Oscar and puffing out his chest. I'm Oscar, Oscar said. Oscar, Bruno said. I'm Jenny, Jenny said. Then they all sat there a minute, looking at each other. Had he and Jenny really only just laid eyes on each other tonight? Oscar eased his arm from around Bruno and struggled to his feet, brushing the dust and ashes off his burned clothes. His body ached, but his mind felt surprisingly clear. He knew exactly what to do. We have to get to the Palmer House Hotel, he said. He said the word "we" very clearly. My mother is there, Oscar said. The hotel is fireproof. We'll be safe there. Oscar picked up Bruno and held out his free hand to Jenny. She took it and gripped it tight, and together they began their journey through Chicago's burning streets. Chapter 9. Monday, October 9th, 12:15 a.m. The south side of Chicago, heading north. They left Jenny and Bruno's burning neighborhood behind and headed north. Oscar kept looking over his shoulder at that giant orange glow bleeding through the sky. The main fire was huge now, Oscar could see, and it was spreading fast, and the wind was carrying sparks all over the city. Everywhere Oscar looked, he saw new fires burning. Some fires were very small, a ribbon of flame waving from a tree, a pile of garbage glowing like a campfire. But there were burning houses everywhere and in places. The smoke was so thick that they had to gasp for breath. But Oscar's gasps also came from what was happening all around them. People sobbing and screaming, horses driven crazy by the heat and sparks, stray dogs howling in fear. Even the rats were running for their lives, rushing out from under the wooden sidewalks and getting squashed under the wheels of the wagons and buggies that plowed through the streets. The crowds got bigger as they moved north. Many people were dragging trunks and suitcases or struggling with heavy sacks heaved over their shoulders. Two women in nightgowns carried a mattress above their heads. On top was a very old man curled up under a quilt. The fires turned the night as bright as day, lighting up the terrified faces all around Oscar. The tear-stained cheeks, the mouths open in horror, the wide-open eyes looking up at the sky. But the worst part was the howling wind, which seemed to be getting stronger by the minute. Each hot gust was filled with dust and smoke and spit out millions of embers and sparks. One burned a hole clear through the toe of Oscar's boot. Oscar passed a woman just as her skirts erupted into flames. Luckily, the man next to her had a canteen of water and quickly drenched her. The sparks were terrible for Oscar and Jenny, but they tortured poor Bruno. Hot, hot, he kept saying, trying to bury his face in Oscar's neck. Finally, Jenny spotted an overturned wheelbarrow with a heap of clothes spilling out. She snatched a lady's hat, its purple velvet smudged with dirt, the wide brim crushed. I don't think anyone will miss this, she said. She put it on Bruno's head, a perfect helmet to protect his curls. She kept her eyes on Oscar, swatting away embers that came too close to his face or smoldered on his clothes. Oscar was getting the idea that there wasn't much Jenny could have taken care of. They came to a corner where a crowd of people had stopped to watch a grand brick building burn. Oscar and Jenny tried to push their way through, but they were completely hemmed in. And then, suddenly, the clanging of bells rose above the roar of the fire. Fire department, someone shouted. People jumped out of the way as two steam pumper wagons came tearing around the corner. Each pulled by two sweating horses, a hose wagon followed. Oscar's heart lifted a bit. He remembered what Mr. Moore had told them. that Chicago had the best fire department in the world, and here was a chance to prove it. Maybe they could save at least part of the city. People in the crowd watched hopefully, as about 15 firefighters hopped off the wagons and got to work, readying the pumper. Uncoiling the heavy canvas hoses in Castle, there was no fire department or pumper engines. When a fire broke out, people had to rely on themselves and their neighbors. During the big fire, a flurry of sparks had ignited the roof of Oscar's barn. Within minutes, 30 people had rushed to their farm, ready to help. They grabbed every bucket and jug they could find and formed a bucket brigade. Mama and the two other women had stood at the well, filling buckets as fast as they could. Everyone else lined up, forming a human chain that led from the well to the barn. Oscar stood on the line, passing sloshing buckets of cold water towards the fire. It was amazing how heavy buckets flew across the chain of hands, how the splashes of water tamed the flames. Oscar had kept going even after his arms were numb with pain. It had taken an hour, but they put the fire out. The roof of the barn was burned through, but the rest of the building still stood. Oscar would never forget how happy he felt when the last of the flames fizzled out, as if he'd helped slay a monster. He watched now as the firefighters dragged the heavy coils over the burning buildings, screaming at people in the crowd to stand back as the pumper engines roared and water pulsed into the hoses like soldiers in battle. The men aimed their hoses. Cheers rose up from the crowd as thick, powerful sprays of water blasted up at the flames. Very quickly, Oscar realized that the firefighters didn't stand a chance. The fire was too big and hot. The water hissed as it got close to the flames and then boiled away into puffs of steam. Every gust of wind, the flames rose higher, twisting and dancing in the sky as though teasing the firefighters. They needed an ocean to put out those flames, Oscar reckoned, or a bucket brigade of thousands of people. "Come on," Jenny said, spotting a break in the crowd. As they pushed their way through, Oscar turned to take a last look at the firefighters. There was no mistaking the fear on their faces. There was no doubt Chicago was doomed. Chapter 10. The three of them walked for at least an hour more, inching their way along the packed sidewalks. They were getting closer to the Palmer house, Jenny said, but new fires kept forcing them to find alternate routes. Now, they were caught in a sea of hundreds of bodies. People squeezed them on all sides. And Oscar struggled to stay on his feet. They were passing by a warehouse when suddenly, kaboom! The smell of oil filled the air and shards of wood flew all around them. "Run!" somebody screamed. Boom, boom, boom. The explosions rang out like cannon fire, like a herd of cattle, startled by a clap of thunder. The crowd erupted into a stampede. Oscar, Jenny, and Bruno were caught right in the middle. Elbows jabbed them, boots mashed on Oscar's feet. He watched as parents were torn away from their children. A woman fell and didn't get up again. "Hold tight, Bruno," Oscar ordered, locking his arm around the boy as he gripped Jenny's hand so hard he was sure he would crush it. If they were separated now, they'd never find each other again. Luckily, the street widened slightly, and they managed to burst out of the crushing crowd. Jenny led them down a side street and finally into a wide alley. State Street is just a block away from here. Jenny said as they caught their breath. "The Palmer house will be right there." Halfway down the alley, they discovered a water barrel. They all ran towards it, desperate to quench their thirst and to cool their burning skin. Oscar felt a stalk of wheat shriveled in the boiling sun. Oscar felt like a stalk of wheat shriveled in the boiling sun. He hoisted the lid off and held Bruno while the boy slurped up water like a thirsty horse. When he was finally done, Oscar and Jenny took turns scooping up handfuls of the cool water and gulping them down. They splashed the soothing water onto their faces and down scorched necks and arms. Oscar sighed with relief. You know what your way around you really know your way around the city, he said to Jenny as he dabbed drops of water onto his burned forehead. You make a good tracker. My mother was a baker, Jenny said, with a hot hint of pride. Bruno and I used to go with her to deliver cakes and cookies. I love cookies, Bruno whispered to Oscar as though he was sharing a deep secret. A picture popped into Oscar's mind. He saw Jenny with her braids straight and glossy, Bruno nibbling on a cookie almost as big as his head. He pictured a lady with Bruno's dark curls and Jenny's big brown eyes standing in the kitchen in a flowered apron. My mama got sick, Bruno said softly. She in heaven. Jenny glanced at Oscar and he glimpsed the fresh hurt in her eyes. The fresh hurt in her eyes. My papa's in heaven too, Oscar said, swallowing the lump in his throat. Our father died right after Bruno was born in an accident, Jenny said. Mama died 6 months ago. I promised her I'd keep an eye on Bruno no matter what. Oscar thought of his own promise to Papa to watch over the farm. That promise had kept him going for these past 2 years, but now it was broken. Would Papa forgive him? Would Oscar forgive himself? Jenny put her hand on Bruno's head. I couldn't let go to the orphanage. Let us go to the orphanage, Jenny said. Her voice dropped very low when she said orphanage, as if it was a curse word no one should ever say. Oscar understood. He heard horror stories about the orphanage in Minneapolis, the city's closest to Castle, that it was more like a jail than a home. Oscar looked at Jenny and Bruno, suddenly wondering what would happen to them. Their home was gone. They were all alone. What would they do? But no, Oscar suddenly remembered they weren't alone. He picked up Bruno. They weren't alone because they had Oscar. Hey, Bruno, he said. I bet up in heaven my papa and your parents are good friends. Bruno leaned back so he could look Oscar in the eye. Like us, he exclaimed. His suit-covered face grinned out from under the fancy lady's hat. Both Oscar and Jenny laughed, and for that second, Oscar forgot about the smoke and the flames, but their smiles didn't last long. They just started walking through the alley again when they heard loud voices. A group of boys swung into the alley from the street. They were walking towards them. Jenny froze, then Oscar saw who they were. The boys from the train station, and there right in front with his rattlesnake eyes glowing through the smoke was Otis Weber.